Welcome, all you wiretappers. Good to be back here in studio Gangland Wire. I've got my good friend Camilla's Cam Robinson. Welcome, Cam.
Hey Gary, how you doing?
It's been a while since you've been on. You've moved and had some changes in your life, but we're really glad to have you back and get you back in the mix here. Do some more Chicago stories with you because you're my man in Chicago. You know that.
I am. I appreciate it, Gary. You are my rabbi, and I'm always here. I'm always here if I can be of assistance. I'm
All
glad to be
right.
back.
Well, good. Today, guys, we Cam came up with this idea, and I thought it was kind of a fun idea for a show. Let's compare and contrast John Gotti and Al Capone. The two, arguably the two most, wouldn't you say, Cam, the two most well-known mafia figures in the United States in all of history? I would say.
Yeah, yeah. For those of us in the who really study this stuff and go after it, I mean, we sort of kind of look askance at Gotti. But if you're outside and you're looking in, if you're just a casual mob observer, then Gotti and Al Capone. I mean, those are the internet searches. I mean, if
Yeah,
you're not somebody who typically just who looks at mafia or mobologist or whatever word you want to call it to have fun with
mobologist.
it. That's right. That's right. It'll be official. Definitely, Gary Capone and Gotti are the two that people are most interested. I mean, they got the most movies about them.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Popular media has paid the most attention
That's
to
right.
him. I've always, and Lucky Luciano kind of ranks up there. And I think they've kind of got cool names and they're easy to say names and they're easy to
Yeah.
remember names. I think, kind of like Roy Rogers or Mickey Mantle, got the real easy to say names. And so people remember that, but they were flamboyant and they had easy to say names and memorable names. So I think the newspaper people probably pumped them up a little bit too.
Yeah. Yeah. In their day, they were the darlings of the press, which is why they're now so well known.
Yeah.
The newspaper followed Capone and the newspaper followed Gotti just because they would allow themselves to be followed. And that's there you go.
Yeah. So let's talk about, a little compare and contrast. Like uh, Al Capone, in my opinion, was much more successfully business wise than John Gotti ever was because he built
Mm-hmm.
single-handedly the whole Chicago outfit, which was, they had what at one time five major crews, as maybe not as big as the five families, but Gotti was just, ended up being the head of one of five families. But and so what do you think about the comparison
Yeah.
contrast with there?
I think like we've talked about. I mean, Capone came along when it was during a wartime in Chicago, and really it was his iron fist. And don't get me wrong, there were a lot of brains behind the brawn. He had real power players working with him, but it was Capone who Torrio chose, and it was Capone who brought Chicago together and created that $1 billion industry of bootlegging, and then spread into the unions and basically controlling every aspect of Chicago, the city, and then expanding west throughout the country. That was under Capone's leadership, and people want to denigrate him now or say, well, Capone this or more brains for breakfast, whoever. There were some great leaders in the outfit. I'm not saying that, but Capone really led a hell of an outfit and really much larger than anything Gotti could have hoped for. Gotti was handed basically the keys to the kingdom, and he proceeded to tear it all down. Whereas
Yeah,
Capone built everything up.
he did. A component seemed like he knew the people to choose to run
Mm-hmm.
things while he sat on top. I don't know whether it's personal charisma. Gotti had a lot of personal charisma.
Yeah.
Capone must have had a lot of personal charisma too, but he chose what was like Tony Accardo to handle the whacking people around,
Yeah.
handle enforcement activities, and
Gambling and muscle. Yeah.
Accardo, he goes on to be the boss, and he picks the right people to move on up later on. Paul Ricca was kind of an interim boss, really smart guy, really quiet, and he had a lot of relationships with other people around the country, and then he got a greasy thumb Jake Guzik to handle a lot of that kind of dealing with government agencies, and he knew that you needed that guy to really deal with the governmental agencies and with the courts and get people in those positions. Gotti, personally, he never did anything like that. He just depended on other people that have the contacts in the governmental, the court systems and the police and all that.
Yeah. The Gambino family definitely had the contacts under Gambino, and then under Big Paul Castellano. Yeah. But Gotti didn't have that wherewithal. He was more of a street guy, and I'm not saying Capone wasn't, but Capone was smart enough to put the guys like Murray Humphreys and Jake Guzik and Paul Rica and Frank Lady, guys in position who knew how to get things done in that world. And that was why the outfit was so successful politically. Gambino's under Carlo, they really expanded, had judges, they had politicians, they had all of that. Gotti didn't really see the value in that kind of thing as much. He just wanted people to kick up because he was gambling so much, and he just wanted green money. And power to him was your ability to point and have somebody killed, or to point and have somebody hurt. And as Capone understood, there's much more to power than just the ability to take one guy out.
Yeah. Just thinking that my friend Bill Owsley, retired FBI agents, we were talking about the Jewish connections here in Kansas City. There was in the gambling world there, they had several Jewish guys that really ran the gambling when it first got going, on a national basis. The race wire was big all across the United States. And Bill said, he said the Italians supplied the muscle and the Jews supplied the brains. So Al Capone knew that. He knew that. And he was, they call it the outfit. We don't call it the mafia. We call it the outfit because Murray Humphreys I think he was a Welshman. He was from England.
Yeah.
Guzak was a Jewish guy. Then Lenny Patrick and who else? There was a Greek too, Gus Alex.
Gus Alex.
Patrick was Jewish. And so there was a whole big Jewish connection too that were important people in the outfit. Whereas with Gotti, you were either Sicilian or Southern Italian of some kind, and you were La Cosa Nostra, and that was it.
Yes.
It was such a closed little society. He'd never thought outside that box of that closed La Cosa Nostra society.
Absolutely. He was so steeped in mob mythology and what was Cosa Nostra, what was, like you said, what was the mob thing to do, and Capone's thinking wasn't as tied in. I mean, he was, and the both of them, as we'll talk about, were Neapolitans, so that mattered much more in Capone's day, where he just wasn't going to be accepted by the Sicilians, and he didn't care. So he associated with more people. He's more successful than most any mob boss, as far as from a dollars and cents standpoint, than any that I can think of. And that rejection, and Gotti felt it too. And I think that whereas Capone went off and did his own thing because he wasn't going to be accepted by Cosa Nostra in the United States, so he pushed on and built the outfit. Whereas Gotti was always going to be sort of looked down upon by the Sicilians, so that he felt a real insecurity, and that insecurity drove him a lot within the mob. And he had to be the most mafia, the most Cosa Nostra. So I think that their responses to that sort of rejection by factions within their own group are very different. Capone was never going to be accepted. He did his own thing and created a much more successful group. Gotti was sort of looked down on in a way for his Neapolitan blood, so he proved that he was the more Cosa Nostra than even the Sicilians. That insecurity really sort of drove him.
And dealing when they caught a case, so to speak, they both had similar ways of trying to deal with it. They wanted to bribe a juror. Gotti actually did get one bribed on that first case where that woman Jacqueline Giacomo or Giacalone. She was prosecuting, and they did bribe that guy $67,000. It was interesting. I did a story on that, and they said we have to have a totally anonymous jury. So what they did is they didn't give the names of the jurors and their addresses to either side. So the prosecution didn't have it either. And if they had just had those names, they would at least ran them through their computers, through their intelligence indices, and they would have found that guy that they bribed. They would have found his connections. They were not that far apart, but since they didn't get the addresses, why they weren't able to find them. Now Capone, great story on when he went to his big trial. They switched the jury out because they knew Capone's people had been out running their traps and getting people lined up that might be on that jury. And at the very last minute, they brought a jury down from another floor and just swapped them. And I guess Capone and his lawyers are standing there with their jaws dropped down on the floor.
And you're in that minute, there's only so much you can say. It's like, well, but that was the jury we bought. I mean, I want my money back. You can't,
too late.
You can't do that. You can't ask for your money back at that point.
Yeah, because, Gotti, it's my understanding, he had guys, when those trials were getting ready to start, he had guys out there watching, trying to figure out who the people were that were going to be in the jury pool and getting their license numbers and starting to figure out who they were as they were picking a jury. And Capone, he didn't have to do all that probably because he had connections in the courthouse, would already gotten a list of all the jurors that were going to be on the jury. So they probably made some money, didn't have to do a thing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So Gotti, Capone was a little more national. Gotti, as we said, he's pretty provincial. He lived in that same little bungalow or smaller house in Queens, I believe, Ozone Park, his whole mob life. He didn't try to do like Paul Castellano and move up into the big house in the suburbs or anything. And he stayed right there. He did put on a big fireworks show for the neighbors every year, is my understanding. He liked that being a big fish in a small pond, it seemed to me like. Whereas Capone, all over Chicago, they knew him personally almost. Yeah. And he reached out everywhere in Chicago, soup kitchens and going to baseball games and sitting on the front row and getting his kid introduced to Babe Ruth, getting his picture taken with Babe Ruth. And more of that's, and Babe Ruth wasn't a Chicago player, so there was more on a national basis. Had the big mansion down in Florida that they would go down to. Had Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello were down there, and so he was more of a guy that understood the bigger picture than Gotti. It doesn't seem like Gotti ever understood and wanted to be part of the bigger picture.
No, I think that, as we sort of talked about, I mean, Gotti was a street guy. When it came to knowing the streets, he was very street smart. He really was. I don't know if anybody can compete on that level with Gotti as far as what the rules of the street. And as a result, his crew was very successful, and Gotti was. I mean, he that's how he became the boss, is because, I mean, his crew was so successful and was so street savvy, but he just wasn't. He didn't think on that level. He wasn't, like you said. I mean, he was in his enclave and he wanted his power and he wanted to stay there, and he just didn't perceive the mob as a national entity. And I don't think somebody like Gotti would know what that meant or what to do with it. Guys like Neil Delacroix, there was a reason he didn't get the power and that Big Paul did. I mean, Neil Delacroix was sort of a national figure, but I mean, he was a street guy and he knew it. For all the criticism against Big Paul, he did know how to run an empire. He just was a little bit soft. And Gotti had no idea. He just had he was, as the constant refrain they say is, are you a gangster? Or are you a racketeer? And for whatever truth there is to that, Gotti was just a gangster. Yeah. There's no racketeering at all about it.
Interesting. I forgot about that saying. Paul Castellano was a racketeer. He knew the value of the unions. Now, Sammy the Bull Gravano understood that. Hell, he was really involved in the unions and with business kind of things where you can make money off of business. But Gotti, he just cared about gambling and are you kicking up and cruise out, doing hijacking trucks and getting swag and the usual kind of stuff, extorting money from the gambling networks or whoever they could extort money from bookies and bars.
Running the family like it was a crew.
Yeah, exactly. That's one thing about Sammy the Bull. He did understand that if he'd had his chance to go up instead of going into witness protection, look how successful he is now on the YouTube. And he said nothing more than that. That guy knew how to. He understood how to be successful. Not about how to be a gangster, how to be the toughest guy on the block. He understood how to be successful. And Al Capone,
Sammy the Bull or Frank DeChico, Capone, and where his deficits were, as we talked about, Gary, he put the people in position who did know how those worlds, and who did know how to racketeer, who did know how to get in. That was Capone's strength. Is like you said, was delegation.
Yeah, the news cameras is a lot different when Gotti was out there. He did play for the news cameras. They were always waiting for him when he was going in and out of the courtrooms. If you notice a lot of the pictures of Capone, he was like, at the baseball game, or he was, with other people. He wasn't, at his mansion down in Florida. He didn't try to play to that whole I'm a gangster thing. He was just like, I'm a big time philanthropist. I'm an important member of the community, businessman here in Chicago. And he used to tell people he was a businessman. He just supplied a product that people wanted.
Yeah, I think you're right. He did see himself more as a businessman. Prohibition was relatively new. So it's hard for us to grasp. It would be like if suddenly there were a legal move to ban alcohol nowadays. And if alcohol became banned, it's not like everybody's going to stop drinking. It would be it was to them as stupid a law as it is to us.
Yeah.
It just happened that there was a moral group that got in there and thought that was the way the wind was blowing. And for a while it was, but the people during Prohibition thought that law was as stupid and useless as basically we would think now. And the people who didn't follow it. Capone really was just supplying something that had been withdrawn from market in all of the normal legal channels.
Yeah.
In any other world, he would be a businessman. It's just it was illegal, and you had to kill people.
And he was flexible too. He was flexible enough when Prohibition ended. The outfit went right into that the wire for the sports for the horse racing results, because everybody liked to bet on horses, but yet there wasn't any place to bet on horses in Kansas City. There wasn't any place to bet on horses downstate. Illinois or St. Louis, or St. Louis had a Sportsman's Park, but throughout the United States, there's a lot of places you couldn't place a bet on a horse unless you went to the track. And even in those big cities, you had to go to the track, and everybody can't go out to the track every day. So they were part of that, creating a national race wire and then make money off of that. That's where the Jewish gangsters came in, and in Kansas City particularly, and I'm sure in Chicago, when they established that national race wire, and the mob was, taking a piece of that action all the time.
Oh yeah. Chicago was in on taking it over from Max Annenberg in the beginning. The CP Annenberg you hear about nowadays. That was Max Annenberg, a Jewish guy who had the news service, and Chicago was instrumental in sort of seizing control of that and setting up the sports book to begin with. So they really. And that was initially under Capone, and then later on they expanded it after his imprisonment. But you do see Gotti stopping and talking to the media and sort of playing, and to come back to what we were saying, and smiling and straightening his tie. That clip that you posted the other day of Capone going to prison, I mean, he sort of jumps out of the car and bounds up the steps.
The king of the gangsters is about to get his, and a lot of Chicago folks are on hand at federal court for a last look at Scarface Al Capone before Uncle Sam puts him away. Here he comes, the big boy himself. What's the hurry, Al? Where you're going, you'll have loads of time.
I guess they weren't aware of the power of the press then. The press loved him because he was this figure that sold newspapers, but he wasn't in it and talking to it as much as maybe a Gotti was playing with it and loved to be seen. Capone just happened to be a famous name.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that. That scene where if that'd been Gotti, he would have been preening and trying to been taking questions and making wisecracks with the media people as he went into the courtroom, which we've seen many times. Al Capone jumps out of that cab and ducks his head down and runs in.
That was a good clip you found.
Yeah, I don't even remember where I found that. I don't know, some kind of something in space. I can't remember where it was. Actually, it was a good one. Well, let's see, what else is there? What other comparisons are there between the two? As far
I
as
think, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
working with Jewish guys, that was so common. I don't know that Gotti ever worked with any Jewish people at all, other than to extort money from them. If they had some kind of action going or business going, extort money from them. I don't see that he had any partnership. I think maybe there was one heroin dealer that I don't remember if he was Jewish or not. He might have just been straight Peckerwood that he was involved with and partied with, that he got that kind of secret heroin or cocaine money from him that he was getting. I think Al Capone, probably, I never heard of him dealing in narcotics at all, even on the sly. Although there were a lot of heroin dealing throughout the United States among the mafia during the 30s. They were in Kansas City. One of our Corksavella, the brother of our boss, he took a pinch for possession of heroin during the 30s. Ever heard of Capone, his outfit being involved with the heroin trade? Surely they were.
Better. I know that there were some guys a little bit later, a couple decades after, when heroin was really big. Some of the 42s had some they didn't have the major national set up the major national smuggling rings yet. It came along a little bit later in the 40s, 50s. Back then, it would have been just smaller amounts. They'd have to be selling on the streets. Like Luciano had some contacts with guys who would bring it over in the 30s, and he set up, and there were Italian guys who set up networks. But for the most part, that major heroin connections that did pass through Chicago and through everywhere was a little bit after Capone.
So, and Gotti, in a way, they were absolutely against it, and he took money from it, but it was on the down low, so he wouldn't get caught. One reason he had to kill Paul Castellano is because his man was a Quack Ruggiero, and Gene and his brother were all involved in it, and they both took pinches for it. They took major prison sentences for it, and Castellano wanted copies of the wiretaps that Ruggiero had gotten in Discovery, and it was going to show that he'd been dealing cocaine. So that was one reason that Capone or Castellano had to go down. It's either his longtime Goomba buddy Angelo Ruggiero or Paul Castellano.
That's an interesting, bringing up that story. Capone was fiercely loyal to people. When there was a Jewish guy, Joe Howard, who smacked around Jake Guzik, Capone went down there on his own and beat the guy to death, shot him. He beat him near to death and then shot him in the street.
Damn.
Gotti, if you crossed Gotti or you ain't mad, he would write you off, period. He was, that sort of narcissistic personality where if you step on my toes, I'm done with you. Ruggiero, he grew up with him. Best friends since childhood. Loved the guy. Knew all his brothers, Gene and Peter, and they were really all grew up close friends. Knew his kids and all. And as soon as Ruggiero talking and said some unpleasant things about him on that tape about, Gotti, this or that or the other, that was it. He wouldn't even visit him on his deathbed. This guy he grew up with. Gotti had a habit of writing people off who got in his way or who insulted him. He couldn't take any kind of an insult at all. He was Capone, on the other hand, was so loyal to those around him. It was just their personality types differ so much. Just Gotti was so small-minded and like you said, it's very provincial, and he didn't have that loyalty to people. And you hear on those tapes talking about throwing Gravano under the bus and letting Gravano take the heat. And Gravano had been right there for him from the beginning. You would never hear Capone. People were fiercely loyal to Capone. When Capone took that pistol charge in Philly, Frank Rio went to prison with him just because they were so tight, and Rio didn't want him in there alone. And he and Capone spent their time in those nice prison cells together. But Capone never would have brought somebody down to save himself or thrown somebody else to the wolves. It's just he was very loyal to those around him, and he loved those guys around him, and he went to their weddings and all. He didn't see people as a means to an end always. He wanted to bring all his guys up with him. Gotti just wanted to promote himself and his own family. And only do it his way, not what was best for them, but what he perceived to be the best.
Interesting. Capone inspired such loyalty that this guy took a pinch and went did a year with him in prison, so he would be with him. Interesting. That's really interesting. Can you imagine anybody doing that for Gotti or for anybody today?
I mean, I think Gravano would have gone with him until he heard those tapes with guys saying, "Well, we'll just throw Sammy." I mean, Sammy was just about there, but man,
he would have. He would have. That's old FBI trick there, man. I've seen that tried several times here, where you get a little tidbit that makes it look like they're talking bad mouth, or they're, maybe even, once you're getting bad mouthed by certain guys in a mob family, you may be dead within a few weeks. And then you take that tape and you go play it to them and you say, well, what do you think? And, either some people, we had one guy said, no, he said, I'll handle it myself. And he never did get killed. I don't know what happened to him, but he died a natural death.
I'll handle it myself. What a badass.
But that is an FBI trick that works a lot. Somebody. Yeah. You got to be careful what you say. Don't be bad mouthing people out there if you're going to be in the game.
Well, that was, like you said, that was what they did with Frank out in Las Vegas. Frank
Collada,
Collada, yeah, that was exactly what they did with Collada. That was how they brought him against Spilatro, and that was what they did with Gotti. And it's a trick they've used quite a bit.
Had a guy on Facebook the other day. Speaking of that, it's kind of an aside, folks, but a guy on Facebook saying, "Well, I want to see that tape where they said that you got to take care of your own dirty laundry out there." And it's such an old FBI trick that happens all the time. Plus that a tape that is never put in court, entered into evidence, cannot be. It has to be trashed when you're done with it. And they could use it, I guess, temporarily, but under the rules of Title III, and that probably borders on violating the rules of Title III to let anybody see it. When I got my tapes, I know there was a lot more conversations, had the transcripts for some of them, but they didn't get entered as evidence. And they're really juicy tapes about talking about killing people and stuff. And I only got the transcripts because they never entered the tapes in as evidence. So they get rid of them. So that's what happened to those tapes. But
you explain that to me. That's interesting. You'd think that those of us who follow the mob world, we imagine somewhere there's these giant vaults of all the best conversations just sitting there waiting for us to be the ones to discover it and digitize them. And the truth is, any tapes that are around are probably so broken down and have decomposed so much at this point that if people like yourself haven't saved them, they're just you can barely hear anything anymore. They're so broken down.
You can't even get a machine to play them anymore. I had a tape from the FBI. It was an old videotape, and it's Milton Rockman coming from Cleveland and meeting a guy in Chicago and to pick up Cleveland's part of the skim. So the local guy said, he said, I've got a machine, but it'll do that, but I'm afraid it'll tear it up because it's not working right. And I tore one up, sometime in the last several months. He said, here's a company in California. So I sent it to a company in California, and they took a look at it. And they said they were able to look at it. And then they said, well, there's not really anything on it. And we're afraid that we'll mess it up if we try to do anything. And so I just had to, because, there's no place else you could even find a machine. So those old reel-to-reel tapes were about like 12 inches or 16 inches wide, great big reel-to-reel tapes with hours and hours of conversation on them, because they may record, but they only mark pertinent. And then they pull the pertinent conversations off. May have a whole lot more, but you just pull the pertinent conversations off. So then you've got all these hours of them just chit chatting, and you don't know what's on there. So it's you got to get rid of them, even if you had them, and even if you had the machine, nobody would have the patience to do it.
Yeah, it's it's like Kodachrome, that song Kodachrome. They used to have Kodachrome film that they would develop with certain chemicals and different things, and they stopped manufacturing the chemicals. So now, if you have any old Kodachrome negatives or Kodachrome slides, which used to be one of the most popular types of film, all you can do is develop it in black and white. It's just the chemicals aren't made, the technology isn't there anymore. It just is so it doesn't exist to develop Kodachrome film anymore. It's just it just is black and white. It's all you can do. So these methods that they used, they don't translate anymore to digital.
Well, this has been interesting, Cam. You got any more comparisons between Gotti and even between the outfit? We really talked about comparisons between the outfit and the five families. I like to put on my Facebook. I think it's Facebook to join up the podcast group. I ask you Gotti or Accardo. So it seemed like it's about 50-50.
Yeah, right. I think it is an interesting idea to cover. I think their ages, Gotti was a little older than Capone, but in the mob world, there's about part of the course. But you look at the two of them; they're very polarizing figures. They're very they're at opposite ends of the spectrum as far as what they represented, but what they really both did is they captured the imagination of the people in their times.
Yeah.
And that is why we look at them now and we wonder about them and it's easy to see the similarities between. When you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that they're much different figures, but the way that they captured the contemporary imaginations of the people who followed the mob and who loved true crime really is why we're talking about them now. And I don't think there will ever come another figure like them. Certainly not out of the mob world. I mean, maybe like a Pablo Escobar or something like that. But certainly the mob world will never see another figure like an Al Capone or a John Gotti that really brings that jumps over genres and brings the average person into interest about the mob. It won't happen again. Those two and Lucky Luciano, that's it. We'll never see another one.
Cam, as always, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Everybody that remarks how much they like you, every once in a while somebody say, well, where's Cam? When are you going to have Cam back on? So I really appreciate it.
It means a lot. Everybody's support. Remember my book, Swan Song, The Real Chicago Mob Wife, is out now on Amazon Prime or on the Coastal West website. Check it out with Lisa Swan, wife of Frank Calabrese Jr. Really tells the inside story of families and what they go through with the mob. It's a really good. It's a good read. It's a really fluid book. We had a lot of fun doing it. Gary, you played no small part in getting me off the ground with that. I really appreciate the well wishes from everybody. Anybody who's seen me on Facebook knows that I've had some things going on. But thank you so much to everybody for all the support. And Gary, thank you as always for everything.
All right. Yeah, I forgot about the book. I'll put links to that, the Swan Song book, the Mob Wife story. It's a great story. And if you look back in the older podcasts, I don't know, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago now, this is sometime around August, the middle of August or early part of August, I put out the interview I did with Lisa Swan and Cam about her life with Frank Calabrese Jr. It is a hell of a story. All right, Cam, thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Guys, I ride motorcycles, so don't forget to look out for motorcycles when you're out there. If you have a problem with PTSD, go to that VA website and get the hotline number. If you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, our friend Angelo Ruggiano has a hotline on his website, and he is a drug and alcohol counselor down in Florida. So maybe you could go down to his rehab and have him as your drug and alcohol counselor. Now you can't beat that, could you, Cam?
Let me get some firsthand. I'll give you some firsthand.
All right. Don't forget, like and subscribe, and give me a review if you think about it. I appreciate it. And Cam, as always, I really appreciate you coming on the show.